In the case of the Conservative government, a party once trusted on this issue, it's been a story not only of passivity, but of blindness and betrayal. Blindness to the consequences and a betrayal of the British people. 26 years have passed since Blair's election in 97, years equally split now between Labour and Tory, with 13 years each. And those 26 years have wrought upon this island the greatest act of national harm in our story. And the evidence is all around us. The evidence is all around us, but let me put it bluntly. We've had more immigration to Britain in the past 2 decades than in the past 2,000 years combined. It's astonishing to contemplate. No country, no society, and no people can sustain such rapid and dramatic demographic change. And of course, all this happened without anyone's consent. The British people were never given a vote on mass immigration, even though it's the single most significant event to have ever affected, or dare I say, afflicted this island. It's incalculably more profound than Brexit and the EU, and yet for a quarter of a century, our elected leaders have allowed it to continue, all but unfettered, having been voted in to do just the opposite. As a result, in Britain today, the indigenous population, otherwise known as white British, is rapidly shrinking. In the 2001 census, 87.5% of the population of England and Wales identified as white British. By 2011, that figure had dropped to 80.5%, and by 2021, it was 74.4%. It's hard, perhaps impossible, to think of another example of an indigenous population of a majority country declining by 13% in the space of 2 decades. At the same time, the 2021 census results revealed that 42% of the 10 million foreign-born residents in England arrived in the last decade, and that's quite without precedent in our history. Here you can see the chart which shows the foreign-born population of Britain since the Great Exhibition of 1851, when it was 0.6%. It took 100 years to rise by 4%. To 1951. Then it took 50 years to jump by another 4%. But now that 4% increase happens every decade. Perhaps more startlingly, in 2005, white British accounted for 75% of births in England and Wales. By 2019, that had slipped to 58%. In 2010, David Coleman, who is a distinguished professor of demography at the University of Oxford, predicted that white British would be a minority in the UK by 2066. That prediction was based upon migration figures which were half of those we are now experiencing. Now, of course, some will ask, why does this matter? Why are you raising all of this? As if this profound demographic, societal, and cultural shift is of no consequence. It does matter, and it matters on the most deep level. You no doubt have already heard, so I won't go into it, the very sound practical, economic, and political reasons why this matters: housing, school places, GP appointments, NHS waiting lists, benefits, etc. But just as important, and perhaps more so, is the impact this has on our culture and the cohesion of our communities and wider British society. Because at what point does Britain stop being Britain? What is the tipping point? If only 30% of the population of these islands is white British, will it still be Britain? How can the integration and assimilation of huge immigrant populations be achieved when the indigenous population is itself an ethnic minority? What will the dominant culture be for television, popular music, film, comedy, sport, the things that traditionally bind a nation and its peoples together? And what about social cohesion and the impact of mass migration on our local communities and indeed our ability just to go about and enjoy our daily life? Because we already know that super diversity, which is the term given to in cities and elsewhere where you have a hugely diverse population, super diversity leads to populations living segregated lives with no contact with each other, parallel lives rarely engaging with anyone other than people that they know. Super diversity often leads to people being suspicious, not just of other cultures or ethnicities, but even of people from their own culture too. And a walk through the East End of London will show you that diversity in action. For example, just imagine 2 or 3 old ladies at a bus stop. We know that if they are of different cultural backgrounds, it's far less likely that they will start up a random conversation than if they were all from the same cultural background. In these and similar ways, our communities are becoming less cohesive. We know in Scandinavia, for example, which of course is very proud of its welfare state and its support for all people, that taxpayers are less happy to pay taxes for welfare when the people receiving the benefits don't resemble them. It's human nature. The cultural divide, of course, is already well underway in this country. As Lord Tebbit has said, we have imported far too many immigrants who have come here not to live in our society, but to replicate here the society of their homelands. Well, the level of immigration that we eventually decide to agree on is for the British people to decide, not for me. But in deciding what level of immigration is appropriate for the future, perhaps the research of Professor Coleman might again offer useful guidance. Coleman offered 3 examples of how different immigration levels would affect the nation. Remember, he said by the 2060s, the white British would be a minority if immigration continued at the 2010 level. But if you reduced it way down to 80,000, then white British would become a minority in 2080. If you use a cross-party group of MPs' recommendation of balanced migration, which basically means 1 out, 1 in, then the white British would become a minority at the end of the century. But even if we had a complete halt on migration, 0 migrants coming over, then by the end of the century, white Britons would be the majority, but only with around 70% of the population.